Where is it?
Başvile yolu lütfen bir daha istedim.
Gel.
Ben bir konsept anlamlar çıkarıyorum. Toplu da yaparlar. Tanrıların gazabı. Brute force also.
Okay, now let's continue. So then moves on to, now that he's given us what he sees as a new definition of the sign, as the sign being signifier signified. And I mean, one of the things that we'll see in later critical readings of Saussure, for example, those of Jacobsen or Roland Barthes or Jacques Derrida, is the way that, I was trying to point this out towards the end of just before we broke, just the sort of inevitability with which, despite Saussure's best efforts to keep us poised, hovering between signifier and signifier.
I thought you were talking about the dog when you said keep us poised.
Keep us poised between, right. Okay. Okay. So, despite Saussure's efforts to keep us hovering, oscillating, poised, straddling these two concepts, as I suggested, there is a certain inevitable tendency to return back to that directionality of the sign, where we move from signifier to signifier, where the goal, the home, the promised land of meaning is the concept. It's too easy to do what Saussure said we shouldn't do. It's too easy to equate the concept with the meaning. Saussure will do his best efforts, will make his best efforts to make that difficult to do by challenging, this is what we were talking about at the break, challenging the apparently objective empirical nature both of concepts and of sounds. I mean, again, moving ahead beyond where we've gotten to yet. Saussure will try to suggest that both the sounds that are meaningful, and I shouldn't be saying sounds, I should be saying sound images, but it takes too long to say that. But both, let's say, the phonic material, the phonic material that becomes meaningful. For example, the word cow in English. Meaningful. English, not Turkish. The fact that group of phonemes constitutes a meaningful collection of sounds is a cultural choice, a gesture, a deterministic act made by an institutional framework. And to the very same extent, and this is more difficult to, I think, grasp, the concept to which the sound cow refers to, or with which it is associated, is equally a cultural affair. Now, that's difficult to appreciate because cows seem to be pretty basic. A cow is a cow. But, think about how the concept of cow might differ, not only from person to person, but from culture to culture. I'm not just talking about, brown cows in one country, white cows in another. But, what is effectively included in the idea of a cow may be very different for someone coming from Switzerland than it is for someone coming from India. So you can begin to see how potentially radical Saussure's notion is, in that neither ideas nor sounds are ready-made, determinable objects. That in each case, They represent what Saussure will call an articulation, by which he means something that is cut. Something which is articulated means it's been cut out, segmented from a larger mass of either sounds or ideas. So, but because we simplify, because we tend to reduce the notion to a nomenclature, a naming process, this stands for this, we forget that on both sides of the link, the association, nothing is ready-made, is God-given, is predetermined. In each case, cultural choice is involved. We simply fail to see that cultural choice at work because for us it's become reality. We're so tied to the terms and we're so tied to the sounds which are meaningful for us that we fail to appreciate that these are nevertheless the result of institutional choices. Okay, this brings us to the first and overarching authoritative principle at work in the sign, which is what Saussure will call Principle 1, the arbitrary nature of the sign. Those of you, some of you I know got a chance to read this, others didn't. Did anyone want to give us a quick definition of the arbitrary nature of the sign? Why does Saussure say the sign is arbitrary?
There's no reason between why we took massa for this object.
There's no, I couldn't hear?
Reason.
Why massa stands for this idea, which is the idea of the table, right? No reason. Could you clarify? No reason? Is it arbitrary in the sense of whatever you feel like? Or can we, when you say that there's no reason?
We could say tassa to this object, and there is no connection.
And yet there is a connection, you'll agree, between tata and what it stands for. Mm-hmm. So where is that connection? Why is that connection? Where does it come from?
Because we learned it in our childhood.
You learned it in your childhood because you learned it as an agreement, a system that was already in place. Conventions, good. So that's exactly what Saussure is trying to tell us here. When he talks about the arbitrary nature of the sign, what he really means, and that's a dangerous shorthand. He says, okay, that's just a shorthand language, because the sign itself is not a me thing. I hope you can see that by now. There is no such thing as the sign. Because the sign is not a thing. The sign is a relation entity. The sign, we might say, is a process. Right? A process, a way of relating one thing to another. What determines that relationship, what is truly arbitrary then, is the relationship between the signifier and the signified, and as you were suggesting, Saussure essentially means by arbitrary, sometimes confusing to students because the word arbitrary can sometimes mean absolutely no reason, right? Like when parents say, clean up your room, and you say, why? And they say, because I want you to. That's arbitrary in the sense of idiosyncratic, without reason, irrational, right? That's not what Saussure means. There are very good reasons why tata means what it means, and very good reasons why cow means what it means, because the rules of langue, the rules of the language, tell us that's what it means. That's the contract. That's the collective approval, the collective agreement which we've all entered into by virtue of being speakers. Okay? So the arbitrariness of the sign, I mean, the examples he gives, helpful, obvious, right? The proof of the arbitrariness of the sign. Where's a good example? What's proof? For example, take any word. Sister he uses, sister, sœur in French, sister in English, right? Schwester, right? Think of any language you want. Those are not the same sound. Yeah, sometimes there may be relationships between those sounds because there are historical, geographical relationships between languages. But we can think of vastly different languages with different phonemes, and they have nothing to do with it. Proof that you don't need effectively the same group of sounds to stand for the same effectively thing or concept, right? Arbitrary nature of the sign. So again, this is another sense in which Saussure is trying to move us away from the emphasis on meaningful substance, on a material element that is the center of linguistic meaning. And he's consistently trying to move us away from that direction. And I say the word substance, keeping in mind again the long philosophical tradition that Derrida refers to again as the metaphysics of presence, right? The role of, even if you've only had a smattering of philosophical training, you'll know that, you'll remember the centrality, you'll appreciate the centrality of the notion of substance in the history of philosophical discourse, right? The search for a substance, that which stands below appearances, that which is truly real, the true substance of reality, right? The hypokimenon, right? The hypokimenon, that which lies beneath the surface. The notion being, as it has been traditionally in Western philosophy, that appearances are deceptive and that we need to go past those appearances to get to the true bedrock of reality, whatever that bedrock is. Whether it's ideas, whether it's God, whether it's mind, whether it's atoms, whether it's dirt, whether it's whatever, unicorns and mermaids, doesn't matter. We find some substance which is the independent, all absolute, real stuff of reality. So Saussure is pulling our notions of meaning away from that philosophical tradition as best he can. Right? Principle 1, says Saussure. Sorry. Principle 1, where is it? 965. There it is. Principle 1 dominates all the linguistics of language. Its consequences are numberless. So we can't emphasize this point enough, the arbitrary nature of the sign, the conventional nature of the sign, that nothing in language is empirical in effect. Nothing is substantial. That all of its elements are arbitrary or conventional. In case you're still confused by that, the paragraph a little bit below helps to clarify. The word arbitrary calls for comment. The term should not imply that the choice of the signifier is left entirely to the speaker. We shall see below that the individual does not have the power to change a sign in any way once it has become established in the linguistic community. I mean that it is unmotivated, arbitrary, in that it actually has no natural connection, no God-given, no empirical connection with the signifier. And that's interesting, an interesting experiment. Can you have a language of one? Not really. You can make up your own language. Children often do. They create words, they create even rules, syntactical principles, and that's fine. But it's not really a language unless they have someone to share it with, and in which case they have a community of two. It's a micro-language. A micro-dialect, a micro-idiolect, all right? Micro-linguistics. So even there, even that example proves what apparently it might seem to disprove, that is to say, that even with invented languages, still, it's not truly a language unless you have a community in which to enact the social circuit, right? Or we all have efforts, you can come up with your own word. You can decide from now on that you're going to talk about, you're going to call book Shlami. Shlami. So I read a good Shlami the other day. Everyone will be like, and that's fine. But everyone's going to say, what? Excuse me, I didn't understand what you just said. You seem to say Shlami. What does that mean? And so you have to, again, you have to justify your terminology. Maybe, who knows? Maybe the word would catch on. Maybe it will go viral. Such a fantastic word book that soon everybody's going to be reading Shlami, right? And they say, to hell with a good book. We want Shlami. And eventually. So the point is that it's not really becoming language until it gains purchase or credence within the larger community, right? And then it becomes linguistic change. You see examples like this on a national level also, like the French Academy is a great example, the Institut Français, trying to suggest words for new technological developments, nobody really listens, right? Everybody says, you know, when the Walkman came out, it was le Walkman, not le baladeur, you know? So it's very rare that top-down changes by government fiat actually work, because language only really functions as meaningful when it becomes the will of the community. And so this is something that Saussure takes pains to point out, that language is precisely that which escapes the individual or arbitrary will of the individual. It's not about what you want. It's about what the collective will of the community wants. Okay? Okay. Two other points that might seem to discredit the principle of the arbitrariness of the sign. Right? These would be principles that would seem to point in another direction, to a sense that there is a natural component to language, that language somehow is mimetic, that it somehow is linked in some way to principles that are natural. And there are two examples. One is onomatopoeia. Second one are interjections. So, how does anyone want to talk about these? Why would these principles seem to challenge the notion of the arbitrariness of the sign, and why do they fail to do that according to Saussure? Anyone want to make that? Yeah.
For example, about onomatopoeia.
Right.
I guess this is how we pronounce it.
Yeah, onomatopoeia. Right, that's fine.
For example, in Turkish, we say kapıyı tıklatmak or kapıyı tıklamak, which means to knock the door. I guess it's the same case in the English, so I can give an example.
Sure. Let Turkish work fine.
Okay, so the word knock actually is a word which is made by mimicking the sound of the wood in the door. Right. So knocking the door actually means like the knock sound.
Right.
It carries the meaning of the sound itself. So it's not
entirely right. Here, language would seem to be an echo of a natural phenomenon. Yeah. Therefore, would seem to be tied inescapably to something real, something empirical. Right? Fukur or something like that. Right? Isn't that water that's boiling? What is it? Fukur. Right? But Saussure insists that, in fact, if we go further along this train of thought, onomatopoeia actually proves the very point he's trying to make about the arbitrariness of the sign. Why did it do that?
He gave the example himself.
What?
He gave the example himself. It's like the same noise when you knock on the door. Yet in Turkish we say you took on the door.
Right.
But you took off not
right.
Goes to knock.
Knock.
Yes. Yet we hear the same noise. So the sound that we attach to these, or the letters with which we try to reproduce these sounds, are completely different from between Turkish and English.
And we assume
they point to an arbitrary or conventional way within which such.
Exactly. Taking into account that Turkish doors might be different than American doors, French doors. But we assume that there is relatively the natural phenomena here is roughly speaking pretty much the same, and yet despite that effort to in some sense imitate a natural phenomenon, the way that languages imitate them precisely follow the expected phonetic rules and regulations and patterns. I mean, it still sounds like a Turkish word, and the English word is an English word, and the French word is a French word. So it's exactly the very transformation of sound into language suggests the introduction of the arbitrary into what is in fact a natural phenomenon.
Can I give an example about the influence of phonology in
yes, sure.
onomatopoeia? For example, the dog barks in Japanese are 1-1.
That's how they bark.
Yeah.
That's the sound.
How
Yeah.
does it work?
1 1.
1 1.
Yes.
1 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in Turkish it's half half.
Right. Hop hop. And woof woof.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So sure. I mean, many wonderful examples, right, that you can find through many languages. And of course, then these become elements of language, and you can have havlamak and havlıyor, and it becomes, in fact, a regular Turkish verb, just like any other verb. What about interjections? What's the problem with the potential problem? What's the potential problem with interjections? I mean, you're going to see it's the same pattern, effectively, right?
They are something that they actually didn't come as the word like masa or sandalye, because they come naturally.
They seem to come naturally because they come often from the body, from intense emotional or physical distress, or right? Is that and
I never heard someone saying "awa" in Turkish when he has hurt himself.
oh, so because they say something else, right? What do they say?
Ay. Or something.
Yeah.
What if the sound? What if the word for the use for with the P is chosen from different sounds? I've seen a dog both making the sound woof and howl, or this sound and this is different.
Those are different sounds.
So what if in the different languages they just choose the like last one or
It doesn't work that way, though, does it?
Well, there is an effort. I mean, first of all, different languages make distinctions in different ways between different sounds. Right? Remember, we're not just talking about the arbitrariness of sounds. We're also talking about, in effect, the arbitrariness of concepts. So in some cultures, there is a distinction made between different kinds of sounds, and others there's not. So the very distinctions, the very concepts that we choose to name, even though Sister told us we're not really naming, is also an example of the arbitrariness of language. But assuming that we do come up with linguistic terms for these different sounds, there too, language exerts its traditional symptoms and shows us the work of convention, right, operative even there. So no matter how many different sounds or how many distinctions we make, we have to come up with terms for them, assuming they become regular parts of the language. Right? So I suppose there may be moments where we all, no one's saying that we don't try to imitate nature. We may hear something. I may try to imitate the sound of that. What is it? Oh, that's a good example of onomatopoeia, isn't it? But I may hear a sound and say, I heard a sound that was sort of a or a and but those are not necessarily words that have become conventionalized. Right? So here again, Saussure is taking pains to point out what he sees as the dominant influence of a collective contract or a convention at work. Okay, so much for the objections to the arbitrariness of the sign, but I hope you can see its importance, that it is the very proof of language as a collective agreement, because it's precisely that there is no inescapable natural link between signifier and signified. It is there in the arbitrary link between sound, image, or signifier and concept signified that the community exerts its force, its influence, its power, its authority. Right? So we return to this institutional framework that is everywhere dominant in Saussure's theory of semiotics. Right? Remember, semiology, a science that studies the life of signs within society. This is everywhere dominant in Saussure's notion of language as the social side of language, the collective, conventional, institutional aspect of language. Second principle that is dominant in Saussure's notion of language, which is linearity. Linearity. That is to say that language unfolds as a line, a succession. This is the dominance of syntax. This is the syntactical nature of language. I know you've been talking, I think, about syntax to some extent in some of your classes already here. Right? Syntaxis, putting together. chaining together, creating a linear chain, right? Whether we talk about language as something spoken, in which case we have one word following another. Right now, you can hear one word coming after the other, and we understand that those words are linked and yet distinct from each other, and so it's both important that they're close together and yet not too close together, or else they fail to be distinct signs. That linearity is what produces meaningful discourse for us. The linear nature of the sign. We'll get back to that. It's an important concept as well. Same thing, by the way, of course, for written signs, obviously. Each word is written after the other. It's true that there are other languages where you don't necessarily follow linearity. Non-Western languages come to mind. But Saussure is primarily concerned with the notion of the Western principles that he sees as dominant in Western languages. Okay.
Every language you have to follow the phone. They are in a.
So even ideogrammatic languages or languages would have a certain syntactical set of rules that would link. Yes, you can't just put them in any order, could you? Okay. All right.
Does this only encompass language production, but does it also include
language comprehension?
No,
or
language production and language comprehension. Because, I mean, I don't know if it's linear, or I don't know if.
It's a good question. Saussure certainly. What Saussure emphasizes in this discussion is the production of language. But we have, but he certainly seems to indicate that we're bound by the same principles of arbitrariness and linearity when we deal with comprehension as well as production. Although you're right, and that one could argue that Saussure is less effective in the way he describes language as comprehension than in terms of production. So that's a good point, and that we want to look for. Now, we were talking a little bit about this notion of the arbitrariness of the sign when it comes to sounds. But I want to also emphasize, and I think this is a difficult but important part of Saussure's course on linguistics, where he introduces the same principle at work in the notion of thought or the conceptual stuff of language as he does with the sound. Listen to what he says here at the bottom of page 966. Because this is in a way Saussure at his most philosophical, his most abstract in some ways, where he's trying to understand really what's at stake in the relational notion of the sign. When he says this, he says, psychologically, our thought, apart from its expression in words, is only a shapeless and indistinct mass. Our thought, apart from its expression in words, is only a shapeless and indistinct mass. Now, effectively, what Saussure is saying is that without words, without language, without submitting thought or concept to the conventional rules and regulations of language, there is no such thing as thought. It isn't thought. It's a shapeless and indistinct mass. And this flies against, this is again a challenge to the traditional notion of the role played by language in the expression of human thinking. As far back as Aristotle, right? We have this notion on interpretation, Aristotle's De Interpretatione, that words arrive as a vehicle for expressing thought. They do that first within the mind. So Aristotle's notion is that we have thought, but that thought, in effect, is something pre-linguistic. And here, Saussure seems to be returning to that notion in some ways, that we have, in effect, here a kind of thought that isn't thought at all. It's both a return to Aristotle and yet it seems to be a rejection of that notion, because outside of language, so it seems to be suggesting, there is no thought. There is no logic. There is no logos. There is no conceptuality. There's just stuff. Blah. We wouldn't even know what to call it. It has no name. It has no identity. It is a shapeless and indistinct mass. Philosophers and linguists have always agreed in recognizing that without the help of signs, we would be unable to make a clear-cut, consistent distinction between two ideas. So it is the very notion of language itself that allows us to distinguish between ideas by carving out ideas as distinct from each other and coupling those ideas, linking those ideas, relating those ideas to sounds, which are also distinguished from each other. And, yeah, go ahead.
Does this mean that if I am alone, I cannot distinguish my ideas? Because you said before that if I have no one to talk to, I have no language. But now you're saying that if there is no language, then I cannot distinguish ideas.
I mean, I think Saussure would say that you, even when you're by yourself, without language, you wouldn't have ideas. Even when you're by yourself, in effect, what Saussure seems to be saying is you're thinking in a language. And this is, we know this is an old debate among linguists. To what extent is there a perception of reality that's independent of language, and to what extent is our vision of reality dependent on linguistic structure? But Saussure effectively is saying here that without the distinctions made possible by language, by distinct sounds coupled to distinct thoughts, we wouldn't have anything to think with.
Which is, by the way, experimentally proven by, what's his name, Carl Lorenz, 1954, etologist.
Mm-hmm.
He started working on
Conrad Lorenz.
Conrad Lorenz,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
He started working on dogs, and
Yes,
then he
famous
transitioned
example.
to human beings. How do human beings structure their ideas in the absence of any formal language?
Right.
Then he arrived at the same conclusions using, I don't know, some laboratory experiments as Saussure did.
Right.
So
It's very interesting, and I know, but we have to also, I believe this is a debate that continues to continue amongst linguists. On the other hand, we have something like the Worf-Sapir hypothesis, right, which to some extent has been, I think, also discredited, which is the idea that our perception of reality is filtered inevitably through a linguistic process. Right? This is the old example that Inuits, what used to be called Eskimos, right, perceive different kinds of snow because they have, 25 different words for snow, whereas in, most languages like American English, we have snow, maybe we have sleet or slush. We have a very crude mechanism for distinguishing between different types of snow. Does that mean we only perceive different kinds of, we only perceive those different kinds of snow? It's debatable, but we can see that the debate continues, and this is Saussure waging his battle to sort of argue that perception, and with it thought and argumentation and logic, depends on a linguistic structure. There's this wonderful diagram here, which I've always thought is disturbing and interesting, which is the way he tries to map out what is at stake in this relational contractual linkage between thoughts and sounds. And again, I think it's easier. I think we can all accept without question the way that different languages have different sounds to stand for different things or different ideas. That seems obvious. Not as easy to grasp the way that different cultures also effectively collect different thoughts or divide up thought differently in order to pair with those sounds. And this is what Saussure means when he says, against the floating realm of thought. I love that, the floating realm of thought. Thought untethered, unstructured by divisions between distinct ideas. Not really thought at all, is it? Right? Difficult to know what this is, this kind of pre-galactic, pre-Big Bang, pre-ordered, anarchic mass of thought that really isn't thought, right? Against the floating realm of thought, would sounds by themselves yield pre-delimited entities? Of course not. No more so than ideas. Phonic substance. Listen to the way he uses that linguistic, that vocabulary borrowed from the philosophical tradition. Phonic substance. Sounds. Phonic substance. The stuff that words are made of, which had always been the object of linguistic analysis. This is where language was. This was the assumption that language was in sound. Saussure says no. Phonic substance is neither more fixed nor more rigid than thought. It is not a mold into which thought must of necessity fit. Of course not. But a plastic substance. In other words, substance without borders. That's not rigid. That can be bent and divided like some sort of viscous gluey material that can be stretched and pulled and separated differently. Divided into distinct parts to furnish the signifiers needed by thought. The linguistic fact can therefore be pictured in its totality, that is, language. The linguistic fact, what is language? As a series of contiguous subdivisions marked off on both the indefinite plane of jumbled ideas, and you see it there, A, and the equally vague plane or realm of sounds. The following idea diagram gives a rough idea of it. Right? I love that. Again, that language, the indefinite plane of jumbled ideas. They're not even really jumbled ideas. They're not ideas at all. They're not thoughts. It's something which we can't even really conceptualize because it's the very absence of concept itself. And you can see then, it's as if, and I think I suggested already that I thought there's a sense in which Saussure's, despite the dry technical aspects of the course on, even the title, Course on General Linguistics, right? Could you find a more boring title for a work? Impossible. And yet, there's a sense in which there's a kind of poetic, creative element at work in this extraordinary text, where it is almost as if Saussure is rewriting the creation myths of the world, like he's re-establishing the origin of meaning. And it's as if here we have almost a kind of creation myth here, where the waves of chaos are being forced into order, into some sort of rigid pattern, which is the very basis of human thinking and ideas and signification. Okay. So that is what language does. Language is there to harness together, to link thought and sound, and thereby make thought and meaning possible. So resorts helpfully, I think, and in a way poetically, to various images, various comparisons that help us understand the inseparable, binary, dynamic relationship between signifier and signified that constitutes the sign, by giving us examples like language can be compared to a sheet of paper. Thought is the front and sound the back. One cannot cut the front without cutting the back at the same time. Right? They don't mean anything until they're joined to each other. You can't cut one side of a paper without cutting the other. Okay? And this then leads to one of his sort of, I think, triumphant statements, where he seems to be trying to capture in a phrase that we can remember and write in our notes, put on exams, as if this is a course on general linguistics. Right? It's actually interesting. The history of this text is also, it's a series of notes left by Saussure that were prepared by his students and produced a text, very good notes, which seem to accurately reflect the content of his course. But so he comes up with these phrases like this that seem to capture what he's trying to say, and he says it in the next sentence here. Linguistics then works in the borderland. Borderland. Beautiful. Almost hard to find this much poetry in most manuals on linguistics. Poetry, linguistics then works in the borderland. This shadowy region on the border between thought and sound, where the elements of sound and thought combine. Their combination produces a form, not a substance. What does he mean? Anyone want to? want to open that up, unpack it, as we might do. We want to unpack that phrase. Unpack it. It's too packed in. It's too concise. It's too cogent. We need something. We need to talk about it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but maybe I do believe it's like the substance isn't actually, like, there is no essential substance there that is produced, and if there is, it doesn't lie in the expression of a thought by language to, like, to produce a sound as, like, a signifier.
Right.
So it doesn't actually produce a substance. Like, the substance either, like, doesn't actually exist as we think of a substance, like an essence, a
Yes.
signified essence that we're trying to reach.
Or a signifying essence, either.
Yeah, actually.
Traditionally, that would have been sound, right? Sound would have been where language means.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that that's
But
not true.
it's form because this form is like, it has cultural element, it makes sense to all of us because of grammar and like because we speak this language.
Okay.
So there is this certain form that means something to all of us, and that is how communication happens.
Why the word form?
Yes, why the word form?
That's what I said. That's what I said. No,
We
yeah.
cannot play fast and loose with terminology like form and structure because of the philosophical baggage that they carry.
Yes. Yes.
Because you also talk about imposing a sort of order on this nebulous realm of thought that language imposes as such a structure.
Right.
But again, we call that form instead of saying that it imbues our thoughts with a sort of teleological endpoint. How do we demarcate
Right.
the sort of form that our thoughts take by using language and the sort of the intentionality or the pathway?
Yeah. I don't think. I mean, I think you're right to be cautious and indeed suspicious. That's the very starting point for a kind of hermeneutic, analytic process. I don't think in this case it's about teleology or about intentionality, but rather the idea of order that's imposed. That order, the order that's imposed, is a fact. In other words, what Saussure is saying is here, he makes this very clear, even if it's arbitrary, once a particular cluster of sounds has been linked to a particular cluster of ideas or thought, once that happens, it's a fact. It's agreed. Sure, it's subject to change, the will of the community. Language changes, meanings change, concepts evolve. Saussure is not denying that. But at any given moment, if we take a cross-section of any moment in history, language exists at a particular state in a particular order, where ideas are linked to sounds. And that's what I mean by order.
If Aristotle was correct in one thing, it was that the efficient, the formal, and the final causes are intimately and inherently are connected with each other.
Sure.
We've been talking about the efficient cause of language. We've been talking about the formality of it. What is the final cause then? How does it lead to? Is concept the final form of data?
Right. Okay. And in that sense, I see what I think that's a good point. I mean, it's in fact what I was saying before about a trajectory or directionality of meaning. In the end, you're absolutely right that language continues to be dominated by what Aristotle would call its final cause. That is to say, that the result, that the purpose of meaning is to establish a concept. Despite everything that Saussure says, the concept remains the endpoint, remains the telos, right? The trajectory, right? And so here we're dealing with the notion that's in Aristotle about the notion of causality, right? And if we know what causes something for Aristotle, we know what that thing is, right? To know what the cause of something is for Aristotle is to know what that thing is. And I think you're absolutely right. There is that teleology that remains, that persists, that remains present in Saussurean thinking. But if I want to speak on behalf of a more progressive more radical Saussure. I think it's important also that we distinguish between his use, as you said, it's important that we not play fast and loose with the notion of the word form. Here he's making a clear distinction between substance and form. Right? It's an old debate, right, in philosophy between the notion of substance and form. And this is where we want to feel the distinction, the dichotomy. That in the end, what language is for Saussure is not a substance, an essence, a magical thing which contains the property of signifier, but rather, and here by form he clearly means something which is not reducible to any essence. By form he means the relational, right? By form he means distinction. He means differentiation or difference. Okay, so we're going to come back. We're going to come back to this notion. Okay, what is exactly he means by form, and how is it distinct from substance? But just if you're confused, go back to that inaugural image of the sign, the egg of meaning, from which will be born the new meaning in a new world for Saussure, and think about it as a linguistic double-sided entity in which neither side is sufficient, is self-sufficient to produce meaning, but only the relationship, the give and take, the back and forward between the two sides, the signifier and the signified. That's a formal entity, right? In the sense, the extent to which form suggests rhythm, suggests relation, suggests structure. Right? Remember, I suggested that Saussure was also, this is not just the founding text of modern semiotics, it's also the inaugural text for modern structuralist thinking. And what is structuralism but a form of thinking that looks and examines human institutions and human thinking, not in terms of substances or essences, but in terms of relationships, in terms of rules, in terms of patterns, in terms of these kinds of systematic linkages. This is what he wants to convey, I think, by the idea of formalism and the distinction between form and substance. Okay. Sure, of course.
I have to draw it.
Draw away. You can erase also if you need to.
Can form exist without an objective?
Can form
Exist without an objective?
without an objective?
Yeah, because I remember reading a psychology study that said, it roughly says this: if you truly want to sit, you can always find a chair, because the idea of chair is not about the way it looks, but the fact that you want to sit. But if there's a fire, then everything around, like even that is not a chair, that's just a blockade in my way from running. So he was basically making the point that maybe the form changes based on objectives you have.
But again, I think we want to distinguish here between form in the sense that Aristotle or Plato uses form. When Plato talks about, and this is why, I mean, form is one of these words that's obviously omnipresent and poses innumerable difficulties because it can mean so many things, as does the word concept. We'll get to your drawing. So when Aristotle uses the word form of the chair, he's suggesting that what makes this chair a chair, or when Plato says the form of a chair, what Plato is suggesting is that what makes this chair a chair is a particular form, right? That it fulfills a particular function by having certain properties. And the other parts, as you say, are extraneous, right? And so the chair, the effort to define what that chair is becomes a process of understanding its formal properties. A chair is that which allows us to sit. And that would be the very essence for Plato of a chair. Reducing the innumerable forms of shapes of chair, substances, wood, metal, those are all blue chairs, green chairs, red chairs, big chairs, small chairs. They're all chairs. What do they all have in common? What they all would share would be the form of the chair. That makes that chair what it is. That makes that chair that thing and no other thing. I mean, that's a very different notion of form than what than what Saussure means. Again, I want to insist that Saussure here is clearly using the word form in contradistinction from, in antithesis to substance. In other words, in fact, the way that Plato uses the word form is more like substance in the way that Saussure is using that term. Substance is the essence of something, right, in and of itself, that makes that thing what it is and no other thing. Form is something relational, something structural, something systematic, something that is not tied to one thing, one essence. Okay? Yeah. Sorry, you've been waiting, yes.
In his communication model,
The circuit, the social circuit?
he said it is not the same concept because A is speaking. A is on the first step.
A is producing? Speaking something?
You have Türkçe anlatabilir miyim?
Anlatabilirsin.
Siz Türkçe biliyor musunuz? We have a concept. I want to talk with you.
Okay.
And I'm thinking about something, so I choose the image acoustic for this. And this is the first step. And the second step, there is a link between the articulatory organs
How you actually produce the sound you want to produce.
and the concept. I link them, and at this step, I'm producing the sound.
Right.
And then I have to use an order. It's linear, and
Right. Each word follows the other in a sort of chain, a syntagm.
I use the canal of, in this model, the canal of
Channel. The channel.
the channel
Of speaking or
Speaking,
words
and
or hearing.
Luft ist hier, damit
Yeah.
ich das übertragen kann.
There's air through which our waves can travel. Yes.
Okay. And then he can only understand if it's the order, and if he knows the image acoustic. And it is not, olmak zorunda değil. Bununla aynı olmak zorunda değil, benzer olmak zorunda sadece anlayabilmesi için. And then he combines the concept. The first step is here, he hears, and then it goes to his brain, and then he combines it, and then he comes to another concept.
And okay. Now, as long as and
And then he's the speaker.
it's interesting to see you
And
trying to trace this process. And I suppose as long as we understand that, it's very difficult not to talk in this fashion. You made it sound like as if there's a sort of sequence. First, there's a sound, and then it's attached to a concept, as if that's a coupling that happens. Right? First, the sound comes, and then it's coupled with a concept. But of course, they're already coupled to begin with. That linkage is part of what makes that concept a concept, is the fact that it's already linked to sound. Now, it's very difficult, though, to talk about it in any other way. As we, the way you're describing it as a kind of narrative process, it's as if sound comes, I link it to the meaning. But you see what we do when we talk that way? We fall back into the very sort of trap that Saussure has set for us. It's not your fault, not my fault. It's the fault of the very terminology, the very system in which Saussure is operating, which is to say that again, there is that teleology in place. That is to say that concept becomes the primary notion here. Right? Sound still remains, even in your attempts to narrate the process of speaking and understanding in this social circuit. sound remains a vehicle. The signifier remains, as it always was, since Aristotle and on into Augustine, remains a vehicle for conveying, for communicating ideas, as if ideas existed in and of themselves on their own. So there continues to remain something deeply problematic and troubling, something Derrida would call logocentric about Saussure's approach to language, because even in this description of language, which seeks to challenge radically the old logocentric notion, it's too easy to think of concepts by themselves, in and of themselves, as that Platonic notion of form, as the substance of reality. The concept is that which continues to stand on its own, the be-all and end-all, the origin and the destination of language. You see what I'm saying? So it's very, very tricky, and this is precisely the critique that, if we had time, we would see Derrida's reading. I mean, Derrida's very project of what we would call deconstruction begins in large part as a critique of Saussure, which is an interesting, I mean, again, another way of understanding and appreciating the importance of Saussure in modern critical thinking, not just linguistics, that the project of what we call deconstruction or post-structuralist thinking is to a large extent dependent on a rereading and a critical reading of Saussure. Right? If we'll see if we have time to talk about that as we continue. But so I love all these interventions; they're really, really interesting, and I think it helps us see the tensions and the contradictions that continue to operate in Saussure, despite his best efforts to pull semiotics away from the concept, from the logocentrism of 2,000 years of metaphysics that still operates in the West. Here's another way of looking at it. Here's another way also. Let's also appreciate the progressive elements of what Saussure is doing, the way he does manage to challenge and trouble the old propositions of Western metaphysics and Western semiotics. Now he introduces a new distinction, and it's the distinction between what Saussure will refer to as what he's been addressing so far, what he calls the concept of signification, signification, and valeur, the question of value. So, I mean, this is just the beginning of Saussure. We just scratched the surface, right? If we want to go a little bit further, we need to understand this extraordinarily important distinction between signification and value. Anyone want to help us out here? Signification versus value. Why does Saussure find it necessary to introduce the term value now into the equation? Why isn't it enough to talk about signification? Look at the image on the bottom of this page. Page 968. Okay, there we have the signifier, right? This is signification. Sorry, I'm in the way here. Signification as it is generally understood, right?
So how does he define signification?
This is signification.
So this is the whole process.
As the word would suggest, it's restricted here now to the notion, to the functioning of the sign, the individual sign, right? Signification, suggesting signifier linked to signified, each one dependent on the other for the process, the production, and the comprehension of meaning. But is that the way language really works? Do signs ever really stand on their own? Obviously not. We've been talking about linearity. We've been talking about chains of meaning. We've been talking about syntax, one word after the other. I mean, isn't that what I'm doing now? Aren't I effectively forging a chain of signs, one sign following the other to produce a sentence, which is also acting in connection with other sentences that I said before? Right, I'm creating structures now, relationships not only between words but between sentences, even paragraphs, references between different texts. Aren't I building a structure that depends on that process of linearity, right? Isn't that the way language works? Of course it is, right? And so really a better way of mapping out language, even in this very rudimentary conceptual sense, is interdependent terms, in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of the others. Take a simple sentence, I am going to the store. Right? Those words mean what they mean because they exist in relationship to each other. Not only that, Saussure will be telling us. Okay, now things get complicated quickly, but there's two ways to appreciate this. We can appreciate relationality not only in the context of syntax or the syntagm, right, the result of syntactical properties, where we have a chain of words which are actually present, right? Let's give a very simple chain. I am going to the store. Try to find the most boring sentence I can find in the world. I am going to the store. Obviously, these words mean what they mean in relationship to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, words mean what they mean. Their true meaning here is not just a function. It's not a dictionary definition. If we talk about purely what Saussure means by signification, it's as if language functions just as words the way they mean in a dictionary. And isn't the dictionary an attempt to define words as if they were static, independent entities? Using the arbitrary law of the alphabetic, order of words? Of course. But is that the way words really function in language? Of course not. Words really function in language because they mean in relationship to each other. That's what meaning is. That's how syntax functions. We create a chain of meaning. And here, this is approaching the notion of value. The value of a word is the word it means in relationship to other terms. So more interdependency, more relationality, more form as opposed to substance. Not only does the signifier mean in relationship to the signified to produce the sign, but signs only mean in relationship to other signs. So we begin to move here from so it was always an illusion to think that the sign existed on its own. Language is a system of signs that work in concert with each other, in relationship to each other. It was always an illusion to think that the sign was an island. No sign is an island that stands alone. Signs only function by virtue of their dependency on other signs. Now, this is true not only on the level of syntax, not only on the level of what we might call parole. And by parole, we mean what? Utterance, speech, statement, behavior. An actual thing you say is a parole. Right? But it also is true on the level of langue as well. It's true not only in terms of terms which are present, but terms which are absent. Which is to say, that sentence means what it means because these words that are present, that I'm actually using right now, exist in relationship to other terms that I'm not using. I'm rushing to the store. I'm running to the store. I'm heading to the store. I'm going to the bakal. I'm going to the supermarket. I'm going to the 7-Eleven. I'm going to... Right, I could have found a host of other terms which are... I need more room here. I'm running out. I need a big blackboard now to do this kind of thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we have the words we actually use when we speak to form syntax, and which are dependent on each other, on their grammatical linkage, on their proximity to each other, sometimes on their word order. right? Boy hits ball. Ball hits boy. Obvious, easy example. Do these sentences mean the same thing? Of course they don't. The rules of English syntax suggest that word order is significant, and therefore the relationship of these words to each other has changed, and therefore the meaning of the sentence has changed. Right? But these are, and that's fairly easy to see when it becomes a question of syntax. But what Saussure is also trying to suggest is it's not only in the combination of words, in the linearity of language that we see the interdependence of language, of words on each other, but it's also in terms of the associative properties of language. The fact that language works through terms not only that are present, but that are absent. Something that's even harder to see. This is what I meant by I'm heading to the store. I'm rushing to the store. I'm rushing to the market. I could have said market. Shop. English distinguishes these terms from each other, and yet they exist in relationship to each other. And it's the value of a word is how much meaning it covers, or how little it covers, and how much meaning is covered, or how little meaning is covered, is a function of what other terms in the language are like it, or are different from it, or are distinct from it. Let me give you an example of what Saussure is talking about here. Look at page 969, a little bit lower down. Modern French mouton, sheep or mutton.
Yeah.
Okay, mouton. Right? Can have the same signification as English sheep, but not the same value. That is to say, yes, you can translate mouton as sheep. You can mutually translate one for the other. If you look in a dictionary, you can look up mouton and it will say sheep. But that's not all it will say. That's not all it will say. It can say that. They can have the same signification. But not the same value. And this for several reasons, particularly because in speaking of a piece of sheep ready to be served on the table, English uses mutton and not sheep. So this is just a small example, but I'm just trying to illustrate what Saussure is talking about here. Mutton, sheep in English. In French, mouton, it's almost like you want to write it with bigger letters. Mouton has greater value, covers a larger semantic field than is the case of mutton or sheep in English, because English also has other terms which distinguish them from each other. This is what we talked about in the example of tick versus tock versus different sounds. Different cultures, different languages have different subdivisions between concepts which are considered significant. So mouton has a greater value, has a greater significatory value than mutton does or sheep does, precisely because it covers a larger semantic field. Okay?
And the opposite goes for chicken, doesn't it? Because it's chicken, but then it's poule and poulet.
Poulet.
But like it's the reverse.
So chicken covers more,
yeah, chicken covers more than poule or poulet.
Exactly. So the opposite in English. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you can find innumerable examples like this. The point being that when we begin to really speculate as to what words mean, it's not enough to talk about the sign in and of itself, on its own, as if it were an independent entity. But again, we're forced into a complex tissue, a text, we might say, of relationality, in which words mean in relation to words that are like them, or are different from them, or not like them, right? That are distinct from each other, each which occupies a certain sort of value, and in some sense implicitly acknowledges the presence of other terms that are like it but are different from it. Let me give you an example of this notion of value which is perhaps even I think a little bit easier to grasp on the level not only of the signified, as we're doing here, talk about what words mean, what their value is, but also in terms of, let's say, the signified. And the example is an interesting one because it's an example that involves the use of language. Sorry, the use of writing. Okay? And it's interesting to see how it sort of introduces the notion of, he hasn't said much for a while about writing per se as a distinct system of signs that operates in relationship to spoken language. So if we turn to the next page, 972. Actually, there's something I want to read before that on page 971, where he talks about linguistic value from a material viewpoint. Right? In other words, he's exploring the notion of value, interdependence, relationality, differentiation, distinction, not only on the level of what we might call the concept, in terms of meaning, but also on the level of signification, what here he's calling the material elements of language. Even though he's already been taking pains to suggest that language does not inhere in materiality, but it just becomes too difficult to talk that way. So he resorts constantly, so it sort of goes back to the very language that he cautioned us against using when he uses words like material, even though he's already made clear that language does not inhere in materiality itself. Nese, devant medim.
But John, can I ask something?
Yes, always, of course.
So we were talking about value and how a relationship or associations between words in that linear context affect how we perceive them and what we think of them. Could the same thing be reduced down to just sounds, or is that what?
Yes,
is that not?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. In fact, let me read. That's exactly where I'm going. Before we even get to writing, which is also, whether we talk about sound or whether we talk about writing, we're talking about, for better or worse, material elements of language, right? Okay. Right? We need a sensory element. That is part of the concept of the signifying. Listen to what he says here. Linguistic value from a material viewpoint. The conceptual side of value which is what we've just been talking about. The way concepts and languages are relational, are formal, are not substantial, are not essential. Right? So the conceptual side of value is made up solely of relations and differences. Another example that just comes to mind, while we're still in the domain of the concept, even though we're not supposed to talk about concepts on their own. See, we're falling back into the bad habits that sort of warned us against. We can't help it. Another example would be terms for relationality and family structures, and the difference between English and Turkish is an obvious example, right? Uncle and aunt. Everybody knows, right? Teyze, hala, right? Dayı, amca, right? Now, obviously, English terms do not accommodate these distinctions. You have to use various uncle on my mother's side, or you have to use various locutions, right? Whereas the Turkish words are obviously cover a certain semantic field which is distinct and suggests, even going beyond language, suggests interesting and significant ideological, moral, ethical, philosophical values which are distinct, right? And you can see then that English in effect has fewer terms, and therefore they cover greater value, or not greater, I suppose wider value, a more expansive value than the terms in Turkish, which are more specified and more precise and distinct from each other. So obviously we can find examples like this. It's not difficult, but that's just one that has certain significant ethical importance in the language. Okay. The conceptual side of value is made up solely of relations and differences with respect to the other terms of language. Whether the words are actually present in the sentence or whether they're not present in the sentence but are merely associated with each other, for example, in our mind. The same can be said of its material side. The important thing in the word is not the sound alone, but the phonic differences that make it possible to distinguish this word from all others. For differences carry signification. This is extraordinary, what he's saying, and counterintuitive. What he's saying, this is what I meant by saying that there is no correct way to say Quebec. There's no correct way to say it. What's important is that we say it correct enough so that, in effect, we don't confuse it with other sounds or other words. That's, in effect, what Saussure is saying here. There is no magical, Hertz wavelength that if you don't match your utterance of the word dog exactly in line with that, wavelength, it won't be registered as dog. The important thing is that you say the word dog clear enough, whether in terms of other words that are present next to it, contextual, or in terms of other words that are like it in the system. Right? If I say, I saw a dog on the street. I saw a dog on the street. I might not allow for enough distinction between words in the chain to allow you to hear that clearly. But if I said, again, I can distort the word enough. I saw a dog, I saw a dude, I saw a derg. If I say it if I go too far, it becomes confused with other terms. The important thing is not saying it one way, but saying it so that it clearly is distinct from other terms. Again, this is an example of relationality and formal differences and distinctions on the level of the signifier, on the level of the sound image. It's quite extraordinary, really. Let me just read this. Let me go down a little bit further then, in terms of writing. Since an identical state of affairs is observable in writing, another system of signs, we shall use writing to draw some comparisons that will clarify the whole issue. Okay, this is a nice example, way to conclude with, because it's something that we can see, we can appreciate. It's something visual that we can see and sort of understand what's going on here. So, okay. In what way is Saussure going to suggest that, even as a system in its own, that writing itself depends on this question of differential value? Okay. Okay. He says the signs used in writing are arbitrary. So it's just like language. There's no reason why, there's no reason why if this means the sound f, it's just the system, right? Greek we can, write it differently, Russian differently, other languages differently, right? Again, it's an arbitrary system in which certain marks on the page stand for certain things. Question or comment?
I have a question about the arbitrariness, because we know that Latin alphabet comes from Greek alphabet, and Greek alphabet comes from Phoenician alphabet, which is a pictographic alphabet. For example, the letter A looks like an ox, and
Aleph,
and Aleph is an ox. So every letter is made by every letter is designed to look like the for example, in Aleph it's supposed to look like an ox, and like that.
Yeah,
so
yeah. It's an interesting,
completely arbitrary.
Interesting argument. And okay, we can certainly appreciate the connection between, historical genealogy between languages. We understand that, the Latin alphabet comes from Greek, the Greek comes from the Phoenician. One would want to perhaps challenge the original, what you're calling, in a way, the kind of mimetic premise of your argument. The idea that the original letter somehow reproduces in a kind of mimetic way the natural object in the world. It may be governed by that desire. There may be a mimetic principle at work in the Phoenician alphabet, but I think we'll still agree that there's already a process of conventionalization that's occurred. precisely by producing an alphabet. You see what I'm saying? Even if the impulse was mimetic,
Yeah.
I think we could agree that there would be an infinite number of ways to draw a bull
Yeah.
that might suggest bull to people. So there too, I think we're on shaky ground. In other words, it's a little bit like the example with onomatopoeia and interjections.
Take a completely different object to represent
Yeah.
the sound up.
Yeah, for example. Okay, all right. So, but it's an interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. That's exactly the kind of objection that Saussure might try to, or feel like he had to deal with. So it's a good objection. It would be interesting to hear more about that. Pursue it further. Okay. Arbitrary. That writing is also an arbitrary sign system, right? There's no connection between the letter T and the sound it designates. That's an example, just like words that mean different things. I mean, different sounds that stand for similar things in different languages. The value of letters is purely negative and differential. By negative, he doesn't mean they're bad. Negative, he means they're not positive. They don't mean on their own, independent, in some sort of essential way, right? So negative meaning means differential meaning, meaning that's relational, right? Letters mean what they mean because they're distinct from other letters. And he suggests that, for example, here's 3 different ways of writing T, very different indeed. And the only requirement is that the sign for T not be confused in his script with the signs used for L and D.
The middle one looks like a capital A to me.
Well, but if you see it as a script, think of it in the context of a letter that came before it.
Oh yeah.
Right? And you could argue, okay, and in a way it doesn't matter. But the point being that just as we talked about with the phonic substance, the same goes for the notion of graphic substance. Derrida will refer to this as the phoné, right? And the graphe, the written and the spoken. Here too, the idea being that there is no magic property that determines when this T really becomes a T. Right? It's not like we have a grid system and your T has to be exactly, it can't lean more than 30%, 30 degrees away from the vertical, and the axis on the horizontal line, the T, must be close to the perpendicular by a differential of, blah, 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 blah. You could come up with an imaginary formula for writing your T. And I suppose people have done that. How to write your T in the correct, proper way. So Saussure's point being that there are many ways of writing T's in practice, and that as long as your T is recognizable as such, not to be confused with other terms that are like it, it will fulfill its function. Just as the way you say dog, as long as it can be distinguished from other terms that are similar to it and yet distinct from it, then you're okay. And the business of meaning is being conducted without hitch. Right? So it's a wonderful example, again, from borrowing now from the use of language that suggests on the level of the signifier, on the material level here, and that's interesting because we might have thought that when we talk about materiality, we might have thought that we were talking about the substance of language again. I mean, what could be more empirical than the way you write a letter, or the way you speak, the way you sound when you talk, the way you say a word correctly. We all have learned to say words correctly, how to pronounce them correctly, how to write correctly. We spent a lot of time in school learning those things. And despite that, Saussure concludes that there is no material substance. There is no substance in language. There is nothing positive in language. And this is exactly what he says in the next paragraph. Right? He says, everything that has been said up to this point. It's always a good moment when you come to a sentence like that. In a text that says, this is good, I could just skip everything that came before and just read this, I'm ready for class. That's what we all did for sentences like this, right? Everything that has been said up to this point, it's great, fantastic, boils down to this. In language, there are only differences. right there, that's it. That's the beginning of structuralism, and it's the beginning of Derridian thinking, one could argue also, even as Derrida critiques that point. Even more important, a difference generally implies positive terms between which there is a difference, between which the difference is set up. But in language, there are only differences without positive terms. Nothing in language, either on the level of what things mean, you write them, or the way you speak them, or the way you say them, is something positive, is something substantial, is something essential. It's always differential. And that is a radically dizzying view of meaning in relationship to the history of semiotics that has come before. Whether we take the signifier or the signifier, language has neither ideas nor sounds that existed before the linguistic system. This is what I meant about your attempt, even though it's a noble attempt, to try to narrate the process by which the social circuit is completed. But neither sounds nor sounds that existed before the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system. The idea or phonic substance that a sign contains is of less importance than the other signs that surround it. Proof of this is that the value of a term may be modified without either its meaning or its sound being effective, solely because a neighboring term has been modified. Again, the importance of context, the importance of relationality, the importance of order, what's near, what's nearby, what's there, what's not there. It's a kind of force field of meaning in which nothing present contains the meaning in and of itself. So we'll give examples from various linguistic and grammatical facts in language. He talks about plurals in different languages and different grammatical facts which carry meaning. I mean, an obvious example would be something like Turkish plural, right? Right? And in which what's important here is not some intrinsic property of the syllable lar that contains with it the feeling of plurality. There's nothing special about lar. And yet, what's important is that we're able to distinguish, going back to, I think, one of your professor's terms, marked and unmarked, that this is an unmarked and this is the marked. And as long as you can distinguish between the unmarked and the marked, it's the difference between these that suggests that becomes a vehicle for communicating plurality versus singularity. Okay? And so really sort of capitalizes on the radical implications for this differential notion of meaning, where it's not about what's in the word, it's not in the sound, it's in the distinction between them, in the difference between them, in the relation between them, that we see. This is what, again, Saussure means by a formal relationship as opposed to substance, right? And here's how he expresses the radical implications of this mechanism of producing meaning. On page 973, whoops, too far. He says here, what is true of value is also true of the unit. A unit, so any unit, anything that's a particle or a part of the word or a part of speech, a unit is a segment of the spoken chain. Notice again, despite his best intentions, Saussure typically, continually privileges spoken speech over writing, even as he's, in some sense, cautioned us against doing so, right? A unit is a segment of the spoken chain that corresponds to a certain concept. Both are by nature purely differential. Again, what's important about l'art is not what it is in and of itself, but it allows us to distinguish between the unmarked and the marked form. That there's an opposition between those terms, right? And he says, goes on to say, applied to units, The principle of differentiation, that's really what he's talking about here, differentiation, can be stated in this way. The characteristics of the unit blend with the unit itself. The characteristics, I've always thought this was one of the most profound and troubling statements in the course on general linguistics. The characteristics of the unit, a unit is anything that carries significance, anything essential, anything we think is important, right? Anything that signifies. The characteristics of the unit blend with the unit itself. In language, as in any semiological system, whatever distinguishes one sign from another, from the others, constitutes it, makes it what it is. This is a radical assault on the metaphysical principle of substance and essence and presence in the West. Right? Again, let me just read it because I think it's that important. In language, as in any semiological system, whatever distinguishes one sign from the others constitutes it, makes it what it is. Difference makes character, just as it makes value and the unit. I mean, to put this in simple terms, what something is in language is not because of what it is. It's because of what it's not. Right? The characteristics of the unit blend with the unit itself. We tend to think of grammatical features as things we add on to pre-existing units, as if there is some essential substance upon which we add things. Saussure is telling us that that's not the case. It's precisely, there are only characteristics. There's nothing that you add those characteristics onto. There are only characteristics to begin with. What's important about kitab is not kitab, it's that kitab does not have lar next to it. What's important about kitab lar is that it does. There's no essential unit onto which you add lar. There's only the distinction, the difference between having or not having. And that makes all the difference.
So, are you saying that all these relations...
I'm not saying it, but anyway.
Sorry. It's just
No, I'm trying to imagine this is what Saussure is saying.
Yeah. Okay, then, even
Yeah.
am I understanding that all these relations between terms, in fact, this chain of relationships between terms,
Right.
are part of the signifiers that was in the was one half of this egg-shaped diagram?
That's right. It's the same. What was true of signifieds is also true for signifiers. So he has two matching sections. One where he argues for the differential nature of value when it comes to signifieds, what we might call concepts, even though we're not supposed to, right? Because the concept doesn't mean anything on its own, and yet here he is devoting a whole chapter to the concept on its own. Okay, and the same is true. What is true for on the conceptual level is also true for the material level or the level of the signifier. All right.
I don't.
Yeah.
I was also
Sure.
thinking,
Please.
Isn't this like? I mean, I find this really interesting, mainly because it seems to kind of really relate to how we view language comprehension or things like parsing. Isn't
Parsing.
it? Because it's very interconnected, and it's just really surprising to me that it's something that he was able to, I don't know, like I don't know if I'm thinking about this the wrong way, but it sounds really consistent to me with the current understanding that many people have
Of
how we relate what we hear or what we read to the ideas in our head. Because, for example, we don't necessarily, this is, by the way, what some people think, but we don't necessarily think, like you said, kitab large as a separate unit that gets added to it, but rather we think of it as a different, completely different idea that has different associations in our head and has different implications, which I think that should, I don't know if I'm expressing myself but like.
Well, I know you've been interested in. I know you're interested in psychology.
Yes.
And you've been returning to this notion of really what one might argue Saussure is weakest, which is in the notion of comprehension as opposed to production.
Yes.
He doesn't talk a lot about that the gaps that might exist between the production of speech or the production of language and the comprehension of language. So again, this is another example of where, in a way, these are questions that Saussure doesn't fully answer. Although I'm not sure that
I didn't really make this as a counterpoint, but I just said that I think it was in line with that kind of thinking. But one thing that surprised me that I didn't understand that fully, but did you say that he didn't want to differentiate between written language and spoken language? Or
I mean, there. If we go back to the beginning of the course on general linguistics, remember there's a bold opening statement where he argues that human language is just one of various sign systems, including written signs, rules for etiquette or politeness. You can imagine all of them, driving rules, right? These are all just different sign systems with different units and different relationships between signs, different rules for establishing syntax or differentiation between signs. And at the same time, he consistently returns to certain notions which apparently he has sought to challenge. For example, the primacy of speech over the material, over writing, the primacy of the psychological, right, as a mechanism that ultimately meaning is made in the mind. So he returns to certain notions of subjectivity, human individuality, meaning, and speech, which are all part of the semiotic tradition since Augustine and even as far back as Aristotle. So he throws them out the front door and they come back through the back door, we might say. Perhaps because inevitably the concept remains the telos, the destination, the promised land for language.
Sorry, could I say one
Yes,
more thing?
yep, please.
I think you also indirectly answered another question I have, but I just want to make sure.
No, it was all carefully planned. But I made it seem like I was just no.
I was wondering if he also, he must have. He considers written language also as a linear process.
Yes.
But I think you kind of answered that by saying he focuses more on how we come to language, how we produce language, rather than how we perceive it.
He doesn't really deal with that question. Yeah. How do we perceive ideograms? Do we perceive it in some sort of literary fashion? He doesn't deal with that issue. Yeah.
Is every semiotic system linear then?
No, obviously not. Of course not. Of course not.
Then does that cause any problems when you try to map other semiotic systems on this model?
Yes. Yeah. And so you'll have later thinkers like Roland Barthes in Elements of Semiology trying to come up with trying to tackle more complex or even hybrid sign systems. Right? So he talks about, for example, Barthes famously talks about, he wrote an entire book called Système de la Mode, right? The fashion system, where he talks about fashion. In a way, he's sort of taking up the challenge that Saussure offers to examine other forms of human activity as sign systems with their own grammars. And he tries to tackle the complexity of doing that in a system as complex as fashion. Why is that? Why is that complex? Why is it daunting? Because there you're not dealing with simply formal units, but you're also dealing with material, with substance, some of which signifies, some of which doesn't. You're also dealing with system, with fashion as something photographic, something written, and you're also dealing with material, fashion itself. But you can begin to see in that challenge that Saussure offers how it opens up extraordinary venues, extraordinary possibilities of inquiry in the human sciences. For example, if we think about the implications, think about the question of clothing. Now think of clothing as a signifying system. I don't just mean when you wear t-shirts that say something funny, right? I mean, think of your outfit as the thing you're wearing as an example of parole. Parole and utterance. Right? I mean, in other words, if we go back to the notion of langue and parole, we can also define these more broadly as rules, behavior, system, event. Parole is an instance of behavior that's made possible and meaningful by the system in which it operates. So let's agree that there's a certain system of fashion in place, certain rules about what we do and we don't do. You know, we're not supposed to wear our pants on our head. We don't wear our shoes as gloves. You know, there are rules and regulations that govern, generally speaking, the way we dress. Something that's different from place to place, from neighborhood to neighborhood. It doesn't matter. There are rules. That's the point. It's not a field of chaos. It's not an unmapped zone. It's a systematic zone. And now, following those rules, you produce your own parole. You produce your own statement. You produce your own utterance. Your own speech act. Again, language versus speech act or utterance. So the outfit you're wearing, t-shirt, Pulp Fiction, shorts, no shoes, that says something. It's a statement. It's his sentence, right? Erkin's syntagm, right? And it's a chain, it's linear, shirt next to pants, they form a sentence. Now, of course, what that sentence means only means what it means precisely because he could be wearing another t-shirt, he could be wearing a collar shirt, different effect with a button-down white collar shirt, right? You could be wearing a suit and a tie, you could be wearing particular kinds of shoes, you could be wearing long pants, not short pants, all of those, right? Those shorts mean what they mean because they're not long pants, not short pants. So I'm doing the same thing that Saussure did with language, but I'm doing it with fashion.
How about the rules?
Just a start, just a suggestion of how we could go and how various critics do go, sort of taking Saussure at his word, opening up the notion of systematicity and grammar to other science systems, including fashion. Another famous example in Barthes, Roland Barthes, is cuisine. Right? There are rules to a good meal. You start with your Waschlanguage, or your aperitif, I don't know, whatever. You move on to the main course, you end with a dessert, right? And that suggests a properly constructed sentence or syntagm in the gastronomic world, or the world of cuisine. Right? The menu provides you with, in effect, a kind of choice, a kind of grammar. Now, when you go to that restaurant and you open up the menu and begin making choices for the opening course, the main course, the soup, the dessert, the coffee, at the end, right, what you've done is you've constructed your culinary sentence, your gastronomic statement, right? And you could play with it. You could say, you know what, I'm gonna start with dessert. That's the way I roll. That's the kind of guy I am. I think I'm going to start with dessert. I'm going to end with the beginning. Okay? But even doing that, you're sort of doing something transgressive. And by transgressing the system, you're sort of acknowledging the claim of that system to authority by sort of doing something counterintuitive. So you can understand, I'm just trying to point out here the implications and the possible applications of Saussurean semiology are innumerable and really revolutionize the way people thought about human society.
How about the rules of driving?
Yeah.
Because it operates in the system of correspondence which is measurable. Right? So it's 120 kilometers per hour.
Sure.
Meaning doesn't stem from the sign itself, but it has to be measured against your speech act. So or your
right.
The way you act out.
Yeah,
whether
right.
or not you're driving 120 kilometers per hour.
Exactly.
So meaning in this regard can be pinpointed in the absence of the unmarked. So okay, even if we didn't have 150 kilometers possible, or even if we didn't have,
but we need that rule to determine.
Do we?
Yeah, let me put it this way. There was a wonderful critic. Have you heard of Jonathan Culler? Another great critic. Wrote a very short piece called something like The Linguistic Factor. Talks about the role, the importance of language as a model for semiotics and structuralism in Saussure and other critics. And he talks about, and he's precisely trying to distinguish between the way that the distinction between rules and behavior is a crucial distinction. And he says, imagine you join a club called the don't step on the lines between the sidewalk. I don't know, some sidewalks, there's a line between the stones, right? And sometimes when you're a kid, you sort of don't walk on. Maybe you might play a game where you're not walking on the lines. Now you join a club. It's called the Don't Stop on the Sidewalk Line Club. And now you join this club. You signed the charter. You're a member. You're paying your dues. It's kind of a stupid club, I know. But just imagine that you're going to a very exclusive club. I belong to the Society for Not Walking on the Lines between sidewalks. Once you do that, you've essentially signed a contract in which now your behavior becomes meaningful in a way that it wasn't before. Right? Now before, you could do whatever the hell you want to. You could just walk. I'm walking on all the lines. Right? Didn't matter. Now you've joined this club. You signed a contract. And now suddenly you said, okay, I swore an oath not to walk on the lines between the stones. Now you may still walk on the lines. You can say, you know what? I'm kind of a bad boy. I like to transfer this rule. Take that. I don't care if I have to pay a penalty. So the very possibility of transgression has been made possible by the fact that you're acknowledging the rule which you're now breaking, violating. So this is what I mean about 150 kilometers per hour. You could be a bad boy. You can transgress that rule and say, I'm going to break the law. I'm going to risk, see if they get me. Wouldn't have been a possibility before. So the notion of ethical possibilities here, or possibilities of subjective expression, are radically transformed by your participation in various systems of rules and regulations. So again, this is exactly what Saussure means by the relationship between rules and behavior. And the same thing is true in language. None of us speak completely correctly. We all violate the rules in various ways, and by violating those rules, at the same time we enforce them.
There's no objective measure to calculate or to
True.
There's no objective measure to calculate
True.
against or so
the way there is in driving, where you go
exactly.
you go above a certain speed and that's it. The device clicks, you get a ticket.
Exactly.
Maybe not even human intervention is involved. Right. Very different systems, different factors.
Okay.
That's right. That's right. Different factors. So it gets very tricky very quickly when you begin to really apply Saussurean semiotic principles to the real life situations where systems are quite complex and not just based on variables as limited as they are in language. Should I call it? Is there some sort of what's the ritual? What's the rules? Yes. What is the rule? Okay. All right. Okay. We can continue to talk about this in a more informal sense, perhaps tonight, or over dinner, or whatever people want to do. And happy to continue talking about, especially in terms of the Derridian reading of Saussure and how he tries to turn semiology into something called grammatology. So that would be a nice. If we want to talk about that a little bit more, we could do so tonight. Okay, thanks. You were a great audience, and.